Discourse. This lecture is named for Josephine Gould, who was a religious education director in Syracuse for many years. She served in both of our churches there. When she died, the decision was made to establish this lecture in her honor to be delivered by a minister in the district on the first evening of district assembly each year. I am Reverend Lynn, the minister in Saratoga Springs, New York, and I have the privilege of introducing tonight's presenter. The Reverend Dr. Lynn Ashley is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. She grew up in South Dakota. Anybody else here from South Dakota? There weren't a lot of them out there, so it's okay. After careers in higher education, administration, and international finance, Lynn decided to study religion and theology. So she attended Andover Newton Theological School, where she completed a master's degree in psychology and religion and a doctorate in pastoral care and practical theology, which centered on chaplaincy in places of work. While still in seminary, she worked as an advocate for survivors of domestic violence and served for 2 years as a part-time interim minister at the UU Congregation of Northern Chautauqua, and in the summer of 2003 as summer minister of First Unitarian Church of Rochester. Following her ordination in the fall of 2003, she served for nearly 8 years as consulting minister to the Unitarian Church of Barneveld, the oldest Unitarian church west of the Hudson River, where she was named Minister Emerita last summer. She chaired the committee which created the Social Justice Council for our district, and she currently serves on the Growth Committee and the Nominating Committee for the district. She and her husband reside happily in the village of Voorheesville near Albany with 2 cats, Pudloffer and Tank. Please welcome the Reverend Dr. Lynn Ashley.
How lovely it is to look around this room and see so many familiar and much loved faces among you, and some new ones. I'm glad to be here. I have been cleaning closets, cleaning, clearing, and redistributing the contents thereof for this past year and more. The process started last year in January, when during a visit with my mother in South Dakota, it became apparent that she would no longer be able to live alone. The first sorting of her life's possessions began then, when we helped her to move into an assisted living community. Last summer, my niece Leslie drove from the West Coast and I from the East to meet at my mother's home in the Black Hills. Our goal for that trip was to clear the main floor of the home my parents built 50 years ago. Leslie and I kept so busy in the brief time that we had together that we rarely took time to give voice to the memories we shared. Clearing the living areas last summer was relatively stark emotionally, compared with the emptying of a bank of storage cabinets that I undertook during a return trip in December. In those cabinets were the archaeological stores of the generations. Mom's sewing stuff, thimbles and pins and needles, and fabrics, remnants of summer dresses and winter jackets, silk of a wedding dress, satin from a prom. There were hundreds of family photos, some of which dated back to the earliest days of photography. Photos of ancestors, many unnamed and no longer remembered. And then of the generations I have known. Reminders of trips taken, long drives across the country, first airplane flights, of oceans and mountains, of skies studded by storm clouds, and those the shade of blue that only the sunshine of the high plains makes possible. There were photos of babies and grandbabies, of old friends long ago scattered, of flowers, extended and blended families, and new frontiers. With limited time, I made my way through layers of family history. Some things went to Mom, some to other family members, some I kept, and some we let go of. When I came to an old gift box from Furley's Jewelers, a little store that once stood in the center of my grandparents' town, my emotional distance crumbled. Expecting to find a cake plate wrapped carefully inside, I wondered a bit when I found nothing more than layers of fabric. Soon I realized that I had uncovered a cache of items that came from my grandmother's closet. Paisley squares of aqua blue and rusty orange, kerchiefs that had been my grandfather's, and a half dozen once lovely hankies, each edged with 2 inches of lace, my grandmother's, and each marred by the lining in of her name with permanent, thick blue marking pen, of violence perpetrated by launderers in the nursing home where she died. Further into that box were crocheted doilies and hand-embroidered antimacassars, against which heads and hands of those much-beloved heads had rested. When I unfolded the first of my grandmother's aprons, torn and stained, I began to weep. Seeing and touching those sweet, tattered linens took me back in memory to my earliest days and to ghosts of people I had loved and by whom I had been loved. I wept for parents whose hair was still full and dark, whose strides and whose minds, whose engagement with their community was marked by vitality and creativity and commitment. For grandparents whose memories have not yet failed. For my grandmother, who had greeted us so often outside the kitchen door in those aprons. A welcome smile, a wisp of hair at her brow, touched by the prairie breeze. In an instant, an obsessive cleaning and clearing of closets shifted from being a job to be completed to one that held a lifetime of memories. That moment brought a gnawing awareness that our own faculties diminish and vulnerabilities increase. While the biggest loss in this transition was my mother's, I wept for all that was no more, for all that might not ever be. Personal losses, those experienced and those anticipated, reside in the clutch of loss pervading the larger society. All our lives are touched by news of the world, by what is happening around us, and the loss of security, stability, a sense of justice, community, identity. We are appalled at the ridiculous gun laws. No offense to you, Connie. Florida's infamous Florida's infamous stand your ground, enabling circumstances in which Trayvon Martin, wearing a hoodie and carrying a bag of Skittles and a bottle of iced tea, was killed. There's another law in Florida recently passed, this the subject of a recent New York Times editorial. And I quote, "The City Council of Tampa is sensibly preparing tight security precautions for the area around the center where the Republican presidential convention will be held. They will be temporarily banning clubs, hatchets, switchblades, pepper spray, slingshots, chains, shuttles, and all manner of guns that shoot water, paint, or air. But not handguns that shoot actual bullets. In other words, someone outside the convention hall will be entitled to pack a handgun, but not a squirt gun. With rare respite, there have been stories of violence and war every day for as long as I can remember. The longest ongoing conflict on Earth is taking place in Colombia. Since 1964, as many as 200,000 people have died in their drug wars. Afghanistan holds title to the second longest running period of conflict. 3 million Afghanis have died since 1978, when Russia was the first to invade that country, or the first in this recent years. The most deaths during this past year occurred in Mexico. 20,000 died in drug wars there. In the United States, the number of veterans who commit suicide each year exceeds the total number who have died in a decade of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just 2 weeks ago, Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times, quote, "For every soldier killed on the battlefield this year, about 25 veterans are dying by their own hands. 1 American soldier dies every day and a half, on average, in Iraq or Afghanistan. Veterans kill themselves at a rate of 1 every 80 minutes. Kristof concluded with these comments, "We refurbish tanks after time in combat, but don't much help men and women exorcise the demons of war. We enlist soldiers to protect us, but when they come home, we don't protect them." 48,000 young men and women have been wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan. The wounds they have suffered will continue to affect them, their families, the communities in which they reside, and this nation for decades to come. We are all wounded because of their loss. Our sensibilities are assaulted by another kind of violence as well, the loss of civility in public discourse. Ironically, on Easter Sunday, the Washington Post reported, and I quote, "Exactly 1 month after the conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh sparked outrage by calling Georgetown Law School student Sandra Fluke a slut and a prostitute in a 3-day diatribe. Stations are standing by him. Advertisers are trickling back to his program, and the news media have moved on. The wealthiest among us buy elections. Stories associated with the interconnected web of finance and power and politics, of PACs and super PACs, cause us to wonder if we have lost our voices as citizens participating in democracy. We mourn the fact that Pacific sea otters like bats and bees and frogs are at risk, threatened by parasites, bacteria, fungi, toxins, and chemicals, loss of habitat and food sources. We mourn the fact that the southernmost maple groves that grace this state will die out as global warming makes it possible now for us to grow flowers and trees in our gardens that a decade ago we could only have admired in New Jersey. Do we believe has become the operative question concerning hot topics of public discourse. Do we believe in climate change? Do we believe that children ought to be taught in 5th grade that evolution and creationism are equally valid scientific theories, and then told to choose which is right in 5th grade? Do we believe that a decent education, affordable health care, and a sustainable wage are rights that ought to be accorded everyone? Do we believe the environmentalists or the economists? And which scientists and engineers in the ongoing discussion concerning whether or not hydrofracking and now propane fracking should be allowed in New York State? Circumstances for which we grieve come close to home. At the news conference at which he reported that Eastman Kodak had filed for bankruptcy protection, the president of the company stated, "We have already effectively exited certain traditional operations, closing 13 manufacturing plants and 130 processing labs, and reducing our workforce by 47,000 since 2003. It's not only Kodak and Xerox here in Rochester and all their suppliers and distributors whose numbers have diminished. There are others that, whose workforces now significantly are reduced, that once contributed to a thriving upstate economy, or they are no more. IBM, Lynn, and Martin Marietta in Binghamton, General Electric and Lockheed Martin in Utica, Carrier Corporation in Syracuse, National Gypsum, Bethlehem and Republic Steel in Buffalo. Buffalo, once the 8th largest city in the United States, was second to Minneapolis for flour milling and second to Chicago as a railroad depot. Now, it is the second poorest city in the country. We have lost business and industry. We have also lost personal relationships. The endowment of the Unitarian Church of Barneveld, for example, was managed for years in the trust department of a local bank. The trustee was well known by members of the church community and checked in with them regularly. Several years ago, that local bank was purchased by Fleet, and then Fleet merged with Bank of America. Now the trustee is in Providence, Rhode Island, and hasn't a clue about the community or the congregation. Confronted and affronted by personal and communal loss, we turn and return to our religious homes, seeking inspiration, community, and hope. More than perhaps any other places outside our own homes, it is in our congregations that personal, communal, and societal losses converge. Every time a minister leaves, for good or not so good, we recall leave-takings of other ministers and of others in our lives, for good and not so good. We remember, and our grief is touched. With each death of a beloved one among us, we recall times in the history of the congregation, joys we have shared, challenges we have endured. Mindful of all that is no more, we grieve. Each conflict, regardless of its severity or intensity, threatens for a time the congregation's well-being, as fear that church, as we have known it, will be lost. For some time, there is the threat that we will lose our personal religious identities. We forget that times of transition open new possibilities. As with every time of mourning, we reconnect instead with our grief. Our histories, past and present, personal, congregational, and societal, influence our response to conflict and potential loss. Whether we are conscious of it or not, whether we name it or hold it in silence, personal and institutional memory contributes to our attitudes and how we behave with each other. We share losses today that include, among other things, that sense of security, justice, civility, political power, and the freedom to express in safety our opinions and to feel heard. We are concerned about the degradation of the environment and ultimately of the ability of the earth and all of life to be sustained. We have lost our sense of community and a sense of knowing who are our neighbors. Our children and our children's children have scattered across the country, and we have lost the wisdom of the generations, the stories of our families, a sense of continuity. Aware of these truths, we are also conscious that we will lose, or are losing, personal abilities, strength of body and strength of mind, and since the turning of the millennium, we have all lost a sense of freedom and of security. We need to be mindful of the disconnects, of the growing chasm between rich and poor, of the busyness of our times, the politicization of the personal, the reduction of scientific truths to questions of belief. All too much is cloaked in political discourse that has been and continues to be purchased by a wealthy few and laden with half-truths and blatant lies, in disrespect, and the determination to define those who disagree as opponents rather than partners in dialogue, to annihilate rather than to cooperate. This reality contributes to personal and societal, emotional and spiritual overload, and brings a degree of existential unhappiness into our homes, our family, and our communities. Henry Nelson Wyman, my favorite Unitarian philosopher-theologian of the mid-20th century, wrote 70 years ago that he believed there were three possible outcomes for humanity. First, he wrote, we may destroy ourselves. Second, we may fall under the domination of a ruling elite that will ruthlessly set policies for its own benefit. Third, national leaders and other powerful individuals may commit themselves to the process of creative interchange whereby we learn to cooperate with each other. End quote. Is this view so different from others in history? Or have we indeed been standing in recent decades at a crossroads? We need to weep, dear people, to take time out of time, to be mindful of the people, the places, the experiences that have touched our hearts and minds. We need to allow ourselves to grieve, for if we do not, it is possible that we will be caught in a simmering anger that covers our pain in bitterness, in distancing that keeps us from forming close relationships, or in depths of despair. The losses will keep piling up until we find our way into them, that we may ultimately let go of them. Let there be no doubt. Anger and pain, doubt and anxiety, and rage are perfectly reasonable responses to some of the losses we experience and to the losses passed down through the generations. The challenge to each of us is to find some way to make meaning of them, to learn that we may move forward into the future, to create and live into a new vision. When I came across that box of linens from my grandmother's closet, I knew I needed to let them go. But I couldn't just toss them into the garbage. I lay them along the back of the sofa. For several days, as I walked past, I paused, taking one, then another, to run my hand over the embroidery and the tatters, to look into the stains. I put on the aprons and told my husband tales of my childhood. Finally, I knew what I needed to do. I cut out the large embroidered C that adorned one of the antimacassars and saved those marred hankies of my grandmother's. I'm not a quilter, but I will make a quilt. At the center will be that sea surrounded by lace, and one day my son will have the quilt, and it will be for him to decide what next. Karen West from our congregation in Watertown told me about finding 3 wedding rings. My mom's, my grandmother's, and aunt's, she wrote. And went on. I explored what they were about. The dates of marriages, the ages of the women, the lengths of their marriages, the children or not. In the end, I was so taken with the sense of closeness that those rings brought me, I decided to put them on and wear them. 3 years later, I still have them on my right hand. I had not seen Meredith Mercer, a member of the Albany congregation, for years, but there we were not long ago, sharing stories on the street of explorations into our mother's closets. When I told Meredith about finding that box from my grandmother's closet, she told me about clearing her mother's attic and finding her grandmother's wedding dress. It was pretty badly chewed up by lots of little creatures, she said. But I saved the piece of lace that would have been over her heart and sewed it into the hem of my daughter's wedding dress. I have heard stories of men's ways of grieving. How you guys tend to sit or stand shoulder to shoulder, bar style, while we women sit around the kitchen tables face to share. A story of one man's grief, which I heard at General Assembly several years ago, has stayed with me. It reminds me that grief is indeed a unique process and one that takes place over an indeterminate time. I no longer remember who told the story, but this is the story as I remember it. After his father died, this man cleared the attic of his parents' home. Not ready to let go of much, he packed up boxes and moved them into his own attic. Then he received a job offer that required a move across the country. In anticipation, he brought out those boxes he had packed away when his grief was still raw, and he began to look through them. He gave some things away, he threw some out, and he took some with him. There were more moves. Each time he would go through the boxes, and each time he would keep some things and let go of others. After several moves, he took up woodworking. He constructed a single box in which he placed the last few things, and he carried with them through his next moves. We carry things across the country. We build boxes, we tell our stories, we write memoirs, we journal, we participate in covenant and affinity groups. We may go deep into the found objects of our ancestors, wrote Karen. And I would add, we go deep into the objects of our own hearts and lives. We participate in church programs, we attend worship, we engage in spiritual practices, and finally, we just may allow ourselves to feel what we need to feel so that we may turn toward the larger communities to which we belong and engage in new and creative ways. Then it is that we turn to read the news. When we see the headlines, our first inclination may be to hide our heads in the sand. or better yet, to move to some pristine, faraway island, white sand beaches untouched by oil spills and uncluttered with plastic from the great Pacific garbage patch. Gratefully, though, deep down we know that we do not have to run away, that there have been other times and other places when we have felt lost, powerless, when whole peoples have felt powerless, when they have been oppressed, suppressed, depressed, and discouraged. Then, touched by unpredictable, unlikely, unexpected events, we change as individuals. Something happens, and we find a glimmer of hope, a sense of reconnection. In community, people unite to respond powerfully to challenging circumstances, and the world may be changed. Henry Nelson Wyman called these turning times in our lives and in the lives of larger communities creative events, and he believed they were manifestations of God. He believed they were God. Moments that originate in the community of at least one other being, in which everything changes. Moments that have the capacity to cause us to shift from despair to hope, to change our hearts and minds. Moments that take us beyond anything we might have imagined or desired. Aha moments, but more. When some new idea or feeling merges with what we already know, and we experience a profound sense of interrelatedness with all that is. When we see something or feel something that we have never felt or seen before, when we are transformed, we experience a deep sense of communion, a sense of new creation, of being and becoming. The world and time and place and space take on new meaning. Creative events may be experienced at the most ordinary as well as extraordinary of times. During a walk in the woods with a friend, believe it or not, during a church committee meeting, or with a public event that shakes the world. Creative events have the capacity to change our lives, to change the associations to which we belong, and to change history. We recall some of those unlikely public events. There was Rosa Parks. Her story always a reminder that no matter how oppressive the circumstances, before we act against injustice, we have to be ready in heart and soul and mind to lose even more than we already have. Remember the Chinese student who would come to be known as the Tank Man of Tiananmen Square? It is likely that we will ever know his name or what became of him. But that image of him facing a caravan of tanks remains indelibly imprinted in our memories and stands as a symbol of one merely being human, courageously confronting a great power. More recently, there was Muhammad al-Bouazi, that fruit seller in Tunisia. He would not live to see the change that his death brought to the Middle East. There are moments when our own grief is transformed, and there are times when the shared grief of entire nations may be transformed. Over this past year, we have witnessed from afar the Arab Spring, a series of creative events of incalculable magnitude, the outcome of which we cannot yet begin to know. But I want to invite you further back in history to glean wisdom from one inspired by another spring, the Prague Spring, which took place a half-century ago and more. Although he lived in different times and under exceedingly different political circumstances from our own, His was a time not unlike these times. Václav Havel emerged as an influential voice for the powerless and ultimately came to understand the profound connection between politics and the human spirit. He understood that the enormity of loss that can overcome citizens of entire nations, and was witness to, participant in, and observer of a creative event that changed the face of Europe. And it began in 1976 when members of a rock group in Czechoslovakia, the Plastic People of the Universe, were arrested and eventually tried. Havel wrote, and I quote, "Those unknown young people wanted no more than to be able to live within the truth, to play the music they enjoyed, to sing songs that were relevant to their lives, and to live freely in dignity and partnership." When their trial took place, a new mood had begun to surface. People were tired of being tired. They were fed up. The trial served as a catalyst to bring them together. Groups of differing tendencies, which until then had remained isolated from each other and reluctant to cooperate, or which were committed to forms of action that made cooperation difficult, were suddenly struck with the powerful realization that freedom is indivisible. Everyone understood that an attack on the Czech musical underground was an attack on a most elementary and important thing, the very notion of living within the truth. Following the trial, a curious group united communists and non-communists. The significance, Havel would write, however, was not that it was communists and non-communists, but that it was a community that was open to anyone. No one was assigned an inferior position. Sounds a bit familiar. Sounds like the Occupy movement. Occupy has been defined by people of all ages and diversities of opinion who have come together. No one assigned an inferior position, sharing a desire to live in the truth and giving expression to societal loss and vulnerability. Already, they have contributed to a shift in local as well as national political discourse and led people to name and to explore fundamental flaws in systems, particularly of government and business, which contribute to social and economic injustice. In a world in which there is that growing difference between rich and poor, where burgeoning costs associated with a decade of wars have led to the excision of programs whose purpose has been to sustain community, health, education, and public good, in which our trust in the basic institutions of government is compromised, in which corporate and economic institutions sometimes spin out of control, the impermanence of careers, people losing homes, losing jobs, in which our sense of security and safety has been compromised. We have been invited to work together toward resolution and reconciliation, to participate in the unfolding of a series of creative events. Václav Havel wrote, "Movements that gradually assume political significance do not usually at first consist of overtly political events or confrontations between different forces that are openly political. These movements, for the most part, originate in the pre-political, where living within a lie confronts living within the truth." Havel understood political systems. He came to question, as have others since, whether Western democracy, with its, quote, mass political parties run by professional apparatuses, with its complex focuses on capital accumulation, and the omnipresent dictatorship of consumption, production, advertising, commerce, consumer culture, and all that flood of information, is the best or only form of government that will work for all peoples and all nations. All of this, he suggested, can only, with great difficulty, be imagined as the source of humanity's rediscovery of itself. Havel truly wanted humanity to rediscover itself. He imagined a radical renewal of the relationship of human beings to the human order, a new experience of being, a renewed rootedness in the universe, a newly grasped sense of higher personal responsibility, a newfound inner relationship to other people and to the human community. It starts, he believed, with the rehabilitation of values like trust, openness, sympathy, solidarity, responsibility, and love. Henry Nelson Wyman would have said that that rediscovery of our humanity is made possible only as the outcome of creative interchange, this manifestation of God. And where better than in religious community? Many of us come into religious community in response to crises in our own lives, to experienced and anticipated loss. We are offered opportunities to respond to our grief, to rediscover ourselves, and to participate in creative interchange, which, as Wyman and Havel came to understand, has the capacity to open the door to finding our way out of loss. So how can we in our congregations participate in the ongoing creative event? What work might we do? What work do we do together that we may ease the pain of these troubling times and participate in the creation of a better world? How many of us came to church for the first time or came back to church after a time and wept in worship? Worship offers the opportunity for each of us to find time out of time, a sorely needed respite from the everyday, in the songs we sing, in spoken words, in the sounds and rhythms of music, in the sound of silence. At every moment in worship, there lies the possibility that we may be touched to the very core of our being. In response to our yearnings, we may experience a sense of connection both to a deep place within and to that which is greater and outside ourselves, the creative event. Our rites of passage, weddings, child dedications, and memorial services are grounded in certain principles of our faith in respect for the dignity and worth of those who participate in the creation of these celebrations, and by doing so, give expression to unique truth and meaning. And yet, in wedding vows and in the promises we make to our children, in the eulogies and communal sharing at memorial services, we are reminded of the values of our faith, of that which is most important about living, being, and becoming, of the importance of family and friends, of exploration and generosity, of spirit, and ultimately of turning to make a difference in the world. We come together that we may think about and respond to the facts of our lives, and we are made all too aware of the passage of time, of the timeless circling of beginnings and endings, the stages of our lives, the interconnection of the most intimate moment of our lives with these troubling times, of our ultimate vulnerability, and of the reality that we are a part of a process greater than ourselves, members in an interdependent web of all living things, of all of space and all of time. We come together that we may respond, that we may find comfort, that we may celebrate, that we may make meaning. With a sense of isolation, too often we come together in our beloved communities of memory and loss to be reminded that we are not alone. We come that we may be transformed. Whether or not we look deeply into the stuff of our closets, whether or not we open the boxes that lie within, whether or not we make and or keep a small box that holds the remnants of the histories of our families, our friendships, and our lives, sew a hem in our daughter's wedding dress, participate in the Occupy movement, the stuff of our losses stays with us if we do not allow ourselves to grieve. We cannot let go if we do not express our grief. And this is a purpose of religion and religious community. In religious community, we are offered opportunities to regain a sense of connection within, with others, and with that which is greater than ourselves. That sense of reconnection, the experience, we might say, of the creative event within our lives, enables us to create a new vision of ourselves, of our purpose in this world. The process often begins in solitude, for at the base of humanity's rediscovery of itself is the rediscovery of oneself. Dive into yourself, wrote a 7th century saint, and in your soul you will discover the stairs by which to ascend. Dive into yourself, and in your soul, you will discover the stairs by which to ascend. And Lao Tzu, 2,600 years ago, told us, for there to be peace on earth, there must be peace in the cities, in the neighborhoods, in our homes, in our hearts. Comment made by Jeannie Crane, a former district program consultant and member of the Canandaigua congregation, has stayed with me. And it's one of those curious things, you just kind of, they stay. We are called to build beloved community within a framework of love. We will not get to love. We will not create the world we dream about if we do not do the work of quieting, of taking time, of healing within. If we cover the pain, if we simply seek to cover up the losses because we're supposed to stay strong, keep a stiff upper lip, get over the death of a loved one in the allotted 3 days, if we deny the depths of our pain, keep busy clearing and cleaning the closets, getting rid of things, getting stuff done, constantly texting and instant messaging, checking off the items on our to-do lists, it is likely that we will remain isolated and disconnected. We may just find ourselves without time or inclination to stop to appreciate the songs of the birds, the perfume of the lilacs, and here in Rochester, that's a pretty good thing. The shapes and the shades of the tulips, and the aroma of a cup of tea. Rabbi Simon Greenberg wrote, "One does not need to fast for days and meditate for hours at a time to experience the sense of sublime mystery which envelops us all. All one needs to do is notice intelligently, if even for a brief moment, a blossoming tree, a forest flooded with autumn colors, an infant smiling." And so we seek solitude. We need to be quiet, where, left with our own own memories, we may open the way toward rediscovery of ourselves. We may begin the journey inward with our own rituals by holding and touching and finally keeping old pieces of fabric, by learning what we can about our foremothers as we wear their rings, by building a box to keep what's left of our fathers. We may begin by seeking to empty ourselves in meditation, or we might seek words to guide us into meditation that we may uncover our own thoughts and feelings. Some of us sit quietly in the wee hours of the morning. Some of us these days are subscribing to the daily e-letter from All Souls Church in New York, a common meditation for all souls, in which we find words to inspire, to guide, to invite us inward, some of which I have included here this evening. Some of us pray not, as the Reverend Davidson Lord wrote, not necessarily to something, but from something to which we must give voice, not to escape from our life, but to focus it, not to relinquish our mind, but to replenish our soul. Two simple words serve as one of the most profound prayers I know. Thank you. It has been observed that simply repeating thank you, thank you, thank you, has the power to move us from despair to a sense of connection. So, last summer, I felt overwhelmed by the number of closets that I needed to clean and constrained greatly by time. Early each morning, I would jump out of bed, get dressed, and frantically begin working. After 8 or 9 hours each day, I would go to visit my mother. She would cry because she just wanted to go home, or she would get mad at me because I was taking her home away from her, and then I would get mad. One evening, way earlier than was my usual departing time, I stood at her door, my hand on the knob, voice raised. Do you really want to be miserable for the rest of your life? Can't you just find something, anything, to be grateful for? And then I was talking to myself. This was a creative event. I began taking some time each day to express my gratitude and to be quiet, to feel the depth of my own sadness, to be present, and to listen deeply to my mother in her grief. Especially as we age, when the vision of our future narrows, when as we lose the people, the pets, the places through whom, with whom, and in which we have found meaning and purpose and pleasure and joy, then may we turn to the small wonders that surround us, for which we may always be grateful. Through them, may we be connected once more and deeply to that small voice within, and to that which is powerful and good and outside ourselves. If we are to do the work that Henry Nelson Wyman and Václav Havel invite us to do, then we must aim to engage in deep conversation with people whose attitudes and beliefs are different from our own. Let us start, though. Let us continue in our congregations in which we search for our own truth and meaning, but too often are reluctant to share it with each other. Where better than in our religious homes to practice and engage in the work of building trust and openness, solidarity and sympathy. The change starts within. It takes time. It is risky. We have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Turning inward may help to cope with and to give expression to loss. Turning outward can take us from grief to hope. Reaching out to the larger communities of which we are a part to do the work of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, taking action to heal in some small way this hurting world helps to connect and reconnect us with life. Working to mitigate injustice then takes the form of spiritual practice. It serves to transform a certain energy that resides hurting deep within into a power for positive change. Working together has the power to take us from being a gentle, angry people to being a gentle, loving people. On a crisp Saturday morning, just a few weeks ago, I joined Lois Griffin, chair of the Social Responsibilities Council at First Unitarian Universalist in Albany. Chuck was there, Chuck Manning, president. We met and rode, Lois and I met and rode together to the Albany City Courthouse, where a few hundred people had already gathered to march in honor of Trayvon Martin. As relatively late arrivals, we stood at the far edge of the gathered crowd and unfurled a banner that proclaimed, can you guess? Standing on the side of love. One of the organizers stood before the crowd, described the route we would follow, and made clear that this was to be a nonviolent response to a violent act. She then pointed to the three of us, standing with that banner, standing on the side of love, and asked, would you lead us? As others stepped up and offered to take turns carrying that banner, we had opportunities to move back and to speak with our neighbors. With the chant, Skittles, a hoodie, and iced tea filling the air, we talked about our sons and our grandsons who look like Trayvon, as does my grandson. And we shared our sorrow for that particular young man and his family. Something happened within me as I lowered my voice and quietly repeated the words, Skittles, hoodie, and iced tea. Skittles, hoodie, and iced tea. That a young black man should die while wearing a hoodie and carrying Skittles and iced tea, his killer freed for too long under the proclamations of public officials that he had simply been standing his ground, offended me. We Unitarian Universalists who were there that morning stood in solidarity and in sympathy with people across this country, and we were standing on the side of love. Touched by creative events in our own lives and held in religious community, may we find ways to feel into and then, over time, to let go of the most painful aspects of our loss. Let us find ways through deep conversation and in silence to participate in the rediscovery of our humanity, that we may continue the lifelong work of creating and recreating new visions for ourselves, for our congregations, for our faith, for the larger communities in which we reside, for all humankind, for this earth and all her creatures. So may it be.